Chefs are not usually scientists or environmentalists or policy advocates. We're in the hospitality business. And yet, I like to think that chefs can have a lot of power. We can help lead the way to a more climate-friendly food system by centering diverse and sustainable ingredients. So I was recently out in southern Maryland in Charles County, where I went to walk through a field of flowering buckwheat to sit and listen to the pollinators. And I was thinking to myself how delicious it would be to make soba noodles from the freshly milled buckwheat groats that would be harvested from the buckwheat in the next field over. It got me thinking back to a quote that's really impacted me. Back in the 1980s, the writer, the farmer, the activist, Wendell Berry, who wrote an essay called The Pleasures of Eating. He coined a phrase in that essay that has been inspiring chefs, farmers, anyone who is a conscientious eater ever since. And he said, eating is an agricultural act. What we choose to eat has the power to profoundly influence the food industry and our environment. In other words, what we choose to eat, our food choices matter. Not just our food choices, how that food is produced, how it's transported, how it's prepared, how it's consumed, how it's disposed of. All of these things not only impacts our personal health, but also the environment. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization reports that more than 1/3 of human-caused climate emissions or greenhouse gases come from our global food systems, from the farm to your fork. And while greenhouse gas emissions are a significant threat, they're not our only problem. Pollution from chemical plants, chemical inputs like fertilizers and pesticides contaminate our water and impact human health as well as the health of our aquatic ecosystems. Soil erosion and declining soil quality reduces food production and can adversely impact other precious resources. The scale of food loss or food waste all along the food supply chain is outrageous on its own. If you consider in the United States alone, more than 1/3 of all food that's produced here is wasted. But also consider the loss of resources expended for the production and transportation of those foods. Excessive extraction for water-dependent crop irrigation depletes our available resources. Water-dependent crops would be things like rice, things like almonds, corn, soybeans. Ever-expanding land use for monocropping, corn, wheat, soy, 75% of which is not even used for human food, but used for animal feed. And grazing areas for animal production leads to deforestation, habitat loss, and depletion of biodiversity. The condition of animals in factory farms, in our industrial scale livestock and dairy production, for me, it's stomach churning. But did you know that more than 75% of what we eat around the world comes from just 12 plants and only 5 animals? In the US alone, since the 1900s, we've lost more than 90% of the fruit and vegetable varieties that we once grew. What people buy and consume here and around the world is becoming more and more homogenized. And there are huge risks relying on so few plant species to feed the world. Does anyone remember or has anyone heard about the Irish potato famine? Chefs are not activists, usually. We're not policy advocates, we're not environmentalists, we're not scientists. We're in the hospitality business. But what I like to think is that chefs have the power to lead the way to a more climate-friendly food system by centering diverse and sustainable ingredients. There are some powerful chef champions and role models that we can look to that are already engaged in this type of thinking and action. One that comes to mind is the New York-based Senegambian chef Pierre Tom, who is known for his advocacy supporting farmers and underutilized crops and for introducing traditional African ingredients like the ancient grain fonio into Western culture through his restaurants and through his food company, Yolele. Fonio is a grain with a minimal carbon footprint compared to many other staple grains, and it requires less water and no chemical inputs like fertilizers or pesticides to thrive. It can be used just like rice or other grains, in cereals, in salads, as side dishes. Like Chef Thumb, Ethiopian-born chef Marcus Samuelsson also advocates for the diversification of the food on our plates, also focusing on the potential of African grains as a source of climate solution. He wrote an opinion essay in the New York Times recently, arguing that African grains such as teff and millet should enjoy the same mainstream status that quinoa enjoys today. He makes the case that chefs, in their role as influencers, can promote ingredients like millet and teff and fonio to diversify our diets, expand our palates, and help create the market and consumer demand for climate-friendly foods. And while these high-end chefs create their powerful narrative of conservation and also cultural connection, their interests and efforts must resonate far beyond their kitchens to drive a food movement. We recently drove our mobile food lab, the Rolling Raptor, out to the U.S. National Arboretum in collaboration with the U.S. Department of Agriculture to cook and to discuss two other climate-friendly sustainable foods, buckwheat and beans. Buckwheat requires little to no inputs like pesticides or fertilizers, and its blossoms attracts insects that also kill other pests. It's a soil improver rather than a depleter, and it uses little water compared to other crops. Beans have nitrogen-fixing properties that enrich the soil and also use less water and land compared to animal proteins. We spoke with crop scientists from the USDA about their development of new bean varieties that meet both farmer and consumer needs, emphasizing taste, texture, nutritional quality, and cooking time. We all have a part to play. We can make a difference by incorporating more climate-friendly foods into our pantries and onto our plates. Echoing the words of Wendell Berry, Chef Tom says that designing a menu should be a conscious and responsible act, making choices not just for flavor and nutrition, but for their climate impact. In our hospitality management programs here at MC, we emphasize that chefs and hospitality leaders are not just purveyors of sustenance. We can be influential stewards of food systems. We embrace creative choices that celebrate sustainability and hold the power to weave that biodiversity into the very fabric of our meals. Promoting biodiversity, locally sourced, diverse seasonal foods, supporting farmers that engage in regenerative, not extractive practices, these are concrete actions that not only chefs, but everyone who cooks and eats can take to increase our resilience to climate change. So not only for our celebrated chefs, not only for hospitality leadership, but for everyone who eats, ask yourself, how can your own cooking, transform into a profound act of stewardship, one that nurtures our health, our palates, and the planet?